At Red Butte Ranch, the scorched prairie of Wyoming, they called the black Mustang the devil, the horse no one wanted. Locked up alone, cursed. Until one fateful morning, when a child's laughter echoed in the wind and from the sky a golden eagle came diving down. In that split-second moment, while everyone froze, one forgotten soul dared to rise and face the sky. Morning at Red Butte Ranch began like any other, dry, early heat and a silence that stretched far and wide. The sun hadn't even risen fully, yet its rays were already slanting through the warped slats of the aging horse stalls, casting long glints across the dusty ground. Jack Whitlow, the aging ranch owner, sat on the wooden porch with a cup of weak coffee in hand, watching the chaos unfold for what must have been the third time that week. "Stand still, you black devil!" Roy's voice rang out from the north pen, followed by a loud clatter of wood against metal. Dusty, the black Mustang Jack had bought dirt cheap from a government holding facility, was once again thrashing like a creature possessed. His front hooves slammed into the floor, sending up clouds of dust. Roy, the wiry, short-tempered young stable hand, was thrown back from the gate, blood spotting his elbow as he struggled upright. "You're nothing but bad luck, you know that?" Roy muttered under his breath, spitting curses as he limped away from the stall. Jack said nothing. The coffee in his hand had gone cold. There was nothing left to say. This was the third time that week Dusty had gone wild. 2 broken gates, a near kick to Roy's face, and twice he'd snapped his chains clean off. Jack set the cup down on the porch step and exhaled, rising slowly. His knees cracked in that familiar way that came with age. He walked steadily toward the north pen, where Dusty was still huffing, ears perked, eyes wide, as if staring straight into someone's soul. "Dusty," Jack called quietly, his voice gravelly and low. The horse paused. He turned his head toward Jack, eyes like polished obsidian, cold, restless. In the sunlight, his black coat gleamed like volcanic glass, but in those eyes, there was something else. Not rage, but pain, wildness, and strangely, no malice. Jack stood by the fence in silence for a long moment before speaking again. "You're not a saddle horse, are you?" Dusty didn't answer, of course, but his ears flicked. Jack nodded, as if the answer had been given. "Yeah, I thought so," he murmured, stepping back, his gaze softening. "Tomorrow I'll call Bill at Animal Control. They'll come and take you away." Roy stood just outside the porch, spat into the dirt, and grumbled. "Should have sent him to the slaughterhouse to begin with. Wild ones like that don't learn." Jack didn't reply. He returned to his chair on the porch and watched as twilight bled purple across the western ridgeline. Inside the house, the kitchen light clicked on. His daughter Sarah was soothing baby Mason to sleep, while Emily Raines, the young nanny from Rock Springs, hummed a lullaby, her voice lilting gently through the screen door. Night fell over Red Butte Ranch like the long, steady breath of the land. Wind from the Owl Creek Mountains blew down, carrying the scent of pine resin and granite chill. Dusty stood alone in the pen, unmoving. No whips, no shouting. Only the moon, full and white, casting his shadow across the earth, solitary and tall. He gazed toward the cabin where the window glowed. Inside, Mason slept in his mother's arms. No one noticed, but Dusty's eyes, they had changed, no longer wild, deep and still as soil, and in them, something uneasy stirred. The next morning, the sky above Red Butte was suspiciously clear, the kind of crisp blue that often came before a storm. The wind carried a damp, strange scent from the mountains, and the sun, just over the ridge, was already uncomfortably bright. But no one noticed. Jack was greasing the trailer wheels behind the west barn. Sarah was buried in a spreadsheet on her laptop, handling the ranch finances. Roy drove the pickup down to town, muttering something about needing more .22 rounds for the coyotes that tore the fence last night. Only Emily and baby Mason had time to linger. Emily carried the 9-month-old out to the grassy patch near the southern fence. She laid a soft green blanket on the grass, set Mason in the middle, and sat beside him with a water bottle and a cloth pouch of wooden toys. "Look, Mason," she smiled, pointing at a swaying purple lupine. "The flowers are blooming. Aren't they pretty?" Mason replied with peals of laughter, flailing his chubby arms, fascinated by the butterflies dancing above his head. From the north pen, Dusty watched. His ears twitched each time Mason's laughter reached him. He didn't thrash, didn't rage, just stood there, still, his eyes less like polished stones and more like quiet water reflecting life. No one knew. A golden eagle circled high above, miles away. She was an old mother, hardened by brutal winters, feeding 3 starving chicks in a craggy nest. For days prey had eluded her, no rabbits, no movement in the brush. But now, as she scanned the plains below, her razor-sharp golden eyes caught a glint, soft skin, small limbs, laughter in the wind. A perfect target, a living meal. The wind shifted, carrying fallen lupine petals. Dusty inhaled deeply, his muscles tensed. No one saw it, but the black Mustang had started hearing something others couldn't. A distant drumbeat, a strange call, a faint warning. He didn't neigh, didn't run, just stood watch. At Red Butte Ranch, something unimaginable was about to happen, and the only one who sensed it wasn't a person. It was the horse no one wanted. That morning, the sunlight spilling over Owl Creek Ridge had a pale golden hue, less harsh than the day before, but the air held something heavy, strange. The sky was still. The breeze barely whispered, like a sigh passing through the land. No one noticed. Life at Red Butte Ranch continued its usual rhythm. Quiet, slow, seemingly endless. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, eyes glued to her laptop. The spreadsheets filled with client accounts were dense, but her mind drifted, perhaps to Mason, who had just learned to sit up last week, or maybe to her late mother, who'd passed 2 winters ago from pneumonia. Sarah worked hard to keep the ranch afloat, playing the roles of mother, daughter, and remote accountant all at once. "I'm taking Mason outside for a bit. The weather's lovely," Emily said softly as she stepped into the room, her brown hair tied neatly, arms full with a thin blanket, water bottle, and fabric toy pouch. "Don't go too far from the fence. And keep an eye on him, please. He's at that stage where everything goes straight into his mouth," Sarah replied, eyes still on her screen, but her tone held a familiar warmth. Emily smiled, scooped Mason into her arms. The baby giggled, slapping his pudgy hands against her shoulders like he was drumming. She kissed his cheek and stepped out onto the porch, heading toward the soft grass behind the white wooden fence. To the south, the sky was subtly darkening. Wisps of unusual clouds were gathering over the distant ridge. But in that moment, Red Butte still looked peaceful. Emily spread the green blanket on the gentle grass, set Mason down, and pulled out the handcrafted wooden toys. A deer, a tiny truck, and a rattle. "Look here, little man," she whispered, gently shaking the rattle beside Mason's ear. He let out a joyful squeal, patting the grass, his eyes gleaming like sunlight on water. Yellow butterflies floated low above the blooming purple lupines, painting the harsh Wyoming landscape with rare tranquility. Off in the distance, Jack was crouched beneath the trailer, tightening bolts, oblivious to the clouds inching closer. Oil dripped onto the dry ground. The smell of metal, horsehide, and mountain wind mixed together, an earthy scent that defined Red Butte Ranch and the generations who'd worked it. Roy, meanwhile, was headed into Rock Springs to pick up the .22 ammo he'd promised. He didn't glance back once, because to Roy, the wild black horse and the crawling baby had nothing to do with each other. Only one being stayed still, watching it all unnoticed, Dusty. The black Mustang stood silently beside the north pen. No thrashing, no kicking, just quiet. But his ears twitched each time Mason's laughter rang through the air. His dark eyes were no longer wild. Instead, they held something focused, intentional, unreadable. The way he tilted his head toward the meadow where Emily and Mason played, it wasn't predatory instinct, nor idle curiosity. It was vigilance, as if he sensed something was coming. High above, where the sky shone blue like polished glass, a female golden eagle was circling slowly. Her wingspan stretched nearly 5 feet, the outer feathers flared like dark fingers slicing the air. She was a warrior, survivor of over 10 brutal winters in the Wind River Range. Her talons had torn through rabbit hide, fox fur, even young deer. But for 3 days now, no prey had dared show. Her chicks were crying, thin, weak sounds echoing from the cliff nest etched into her mind. As she soared over Red Butte Ranch, the eagle stalled midair. Her golden eyes, sharp as scalpels, precise as rifle scopes, swept the landscape. A flicker of motion in the grass drew her attention. Sunlight lit the soft skin of a tiny creature playing beneath the morning sky. She dipped lower, silent as a passing shadow. No sound, no warning. On the ground, Emily had stepped away from the blanket to gather lupines near the southern fence, about 10 yards from Mason. She was distracted, selecting the best blooms for a bouquet she planned to give Sarah. A light breeze tugged at her skirt. Behind her, Mason's rattle clinked gently. "Don't go wandering, little man," Emily called over her shoulder, half smiling, knowing full well he couldn't crawl far. She bent down, plucking a rare blue flower. Its petals felt like paper, but carried a sweet, clean scent. Then came a sound, faint, like a blade whispering through air, slicing just above her head. Emily looked up, frowning. Nothing, only a blue sky and a few crows flapping far on the horizon. But Dusty had tensed like a coiled spring. His eyes flared, ears shot forward, his legs shifted forward. A low, guttural sound rumbled in his throat, not a whinny, but a growl. The kind of sound only creatures that had survived wilderness ever made. He had heard feathers. He had smelled the cold scent of metal in the air. More than that, he had felt the wind shift. The breeze now came from the mountains, backward into the ranch, and in it, the scent of sap and hunger. Back in the barn, Jack had just tightened the last bolt when Mason's giggle drifted past, then abruptly stopped. Jack's heart skipped. Inside the house, Sarah froze. She rose from her desk and stepped toward the window. A tearing sound rang out, like a sickle ripping through cloth. Emily spun around. The blanket, empty. No Mason, no toys, no laughter. Only a patch of flattened grass and a black shadow sweeping across the sky. Everything happened faster than a blink. Emily turned around, her heart slamming against her ribs when she saw the blanket empty. Mason was gone. Her brain screamed alarms, but her feet froze. 1 second. 2. Then she broke into a sprint toward the green blanket, just as a massive shadow sliced down from the sky like the blade of death. The female golden eagle tucked her wings tight, her entire body forming a streamlined black spear. No more circling, no more patience. She dove, direct at 90 miles per hour, straight toward the baby in the grass. Sarah, watching from the office window, saw it all. She didn't scream. Her breath just stopped, like she'd been punched in the gut. Then her voice shattered the air. "Mason." In the barn, Jack dropped his wrench. His knees buckled. "Dear God," he gasped, stumbling over the oil drum. He tried to run, but nothing worked. Only one being reacted in time, Dusty. At the sound of Sarah's scream, the black horse reared up, front hooves slamming into the gate. The rotted wood exploded under his weight. Chains snapped off the metal ring, the noise like a trumpet blast across the ranch. Dust burst from the stall. Grass tore beneath his hooves. He bolted from the north pen like a resurrected spirit, head low, mane flying wild in the wind. He didn't wait for a signal, didn't hesitate, didn't look back. Every muscle in his body locked onto one purpose: reaching the child. Each hoof strike thundered like a gunshot. Every gallop was a vow. The eagle continued her descent, talons outstretched, eyes blazing like molten gold, zeroing in on Mason, still seated, laughing, his tiny hands reaching for a flower. Emily screamed as she saw the black Mustang charging across the fence line. Her legs buckled. She couldn't move, but in Dusty's eyes, she saw something not wild, but deliberate, focused, instinctual. Inside the house, Sarah nearly tore the door off its hinges. Jack leapt the porch steps, crashing through wood piles and rolls of wire fencing. He was old, but his legs still carried the reflexes of a father. The eagle was mere feet from Mason. Dusty was 2 seconds away. Then, it happened. In a moment that stretched time thin, sunlight filtered through dust and swaying lupines. Mason sat in the grass, giggling, unaware that death was falling from the sky. The eagle spread her talons, her wings casting a monstrous shadow over the meadow. Dusty leapt, all 4 hooves off the ground. His body arched like a war bow mid-release, and he landed between the child and the predator. The eagle's claws raked his shoulder, blood sprayed dark and vivid. But Dusty didn't back down. He planted himself like a living shield, fully covering Mason with his body. The eagle flailed, startled by resistance. She missed her strike. Her wings clipped Dusty's side, slicing feathers into the air, then jerked upward in confusion, a cry bursting from her throat, part fury, part bewilderment. Sarah collapsed to her knees, sobbing into her palms. Emily fell beside the blanket, trembling, as Mason sat unscathed, cooing, blissfully unaware. Dusty stood still, breathing hard, bleeding, but unmoved. Jack halted mid-run. He didn't speak, just stared at the horse he had nearly ordered removed. Dusty turned to face him. For the first time since arriving at Red Butte, his eyes didn't shy away. They weren't shadows anymore. They were fire. Purpose. The sacred instinct of a free soul that had just made a choice to protect. Above them, the eagle banked hard. She wasn't finished. Her chicks were still starving. But this time she didn't dive. She circled, watching. Eyes still locked on Dusty. Dusty stepped back, putting himself between Mason and the sky once more. Ears forward. Bleeding, but still. Emily reached the boy, scooping him up, her body shaking with sobs. Mason clapped his hands, laughing, like the whole thing was a brilliant game in the sunshine. Jack arrived last. He placed a hand gently on Dusty's shoulder. The horse didn't flinch, didn't step away. "Oh, Lord," Jack whispered. You saved him." Sarah hugged Emily tight, both women sobbing, but these tears were full of gratitude. Above them, the eagle hadn't left, but something in her gaze had shifted. For the first time, she saw a creature that didn't run, a creature that wasn't prey. She shrieked, not in rage, but as if issuing one final warning, and veered off, circling wider, searching for another path. The sky darkened slightly. Northern clouds cast long shadows across the hills. The wind picked up stronger now. But in the middle of the swirling breeze, the iron tang of blood and the red Wyoming dust, Red Butte Ranch had witnessed something no one could have expected. The most hated horse had become its sacred guardian. The wind howled through the aged cottonwoods around Red Butte Ranch, carrying the cold breath of the northern peaks. The sky was no longer blue. It had turned to slabs of slate-gray clouds, gathering heavy and ominous. The once soft grass was now shrouded in shifting shadows, and in the center of that darkened clearing stood 3 lives, suspended in fate: Dusty, Emily, and baby Mason. Emily was still on her knees, clutching Mason to her chest, her whole body trembling with shock and fear. Next to her, Dusty stood like a statue, his shoulders soaked in blood, but his eyes unflinching. The eagle had circled and vanished into the tree line beyond the ridge, but they all knew it wasn't gone for good. Sarah ran to them and fell to her knees, checking Mason head to toe. The baby blinked, his wide brown eyes filled with innocence. Not a scratch, not a single tear, just a quiet, confused smile, as if he dreamed of something strange and magical in the meadow. "You're okay. You're really okay," Sarah whispered, tears rolling freely down her face, soaking into his soft hair, clinging to the scent of milk and grass. Jack stood behind Dusty. His hands trembled, but his eyes burned bright with something new. He had seen it, something beyond bravery, something primal. A choice made not by instinct but by heart. "This horse," Jack muttered. "He knew." What the hell just happened? Roy skidded his pickup truck to a stop by the fence. He jumped out, mouth open, staring like he'd stumbled into a movie set. Sarah turned, voice still ragged. "He saved Mason." "What?" "Dusty. The horse you wanted gone." He broke out, charged across the field, and put himself between the baby and the eagle. Roy stood frozen. For once his face was stripped of sarcasm or fear. He slowly removed his cowboy hat, pressing it to his chest in silence. The wind suddenly died. Jack looked up. "It's coming back." The eagle reappeared, slicing through the clouds. This time, no circling, no testing. She glided lower, sharper, her golden eyes blazing, her massive wings stretched wide like a storm front ready to descend. There was no doubt. She had chosen Dusty as her enemy now. Below, Dusty let out a soft, rumbling breath and turned his head toward Jack. A glance, just enough to make sure the old man would stay back, then he stepped forward again, placing himself directly between the family and the falling sky. Dry grass flared under his hooves. The air thickened, electric. The eagle shrieked, a sound that made Emily flinch and Roy's knuckles turn white around his rifle. He started to lift it, but Jack reached over and stopped him. "No, trust him." This time, the eagle didn't waste a second. She tucked her wings and dove, talons arched like grappling hooks. The distance closed in heartbeats. Dusty didn't move, didn't flinch. He waited. Then, just as the shadow of wings crashed onto the grass, he rose. Rearing onto his hind legs, Dusty lifted himself like a thunder god, hooves striking the sky. He kicked upward, a precise, violent motion, timed like he'd waited his entire life for this 1 second. The eagle's talons missed their mark. Her momentum faltered. She grazed Dusty's shoulder, tearing another wound, but not enough. He spun, hooves slamming down, then lashed out again, his back legs firing like sledgehammers. A whoosh! Black feathers burst into the air. The eagle screeched in shock and swerved upward, feathers spiraling like smoke. "Holy hell," Roy whispered. Sarah clutched Mason tighter, as if afraid he might vanish with the wind. Dusty stepped back, chest heaving. Blood soaked his front leg, but his eyes still burned with that same fierce clarity. Jack stared at him, voice low. He's not fighting for blood, not for survival. He's choosing. Choosing what's right. No one answered. Only the eagle's wing beats echoed across the valley. But everyone knew the fight wasn't over yet. A second scream ripped through the air. The eagle had returned for a third attack, but this time she didn't dive. She flew low, skimming just above the grass. A new strategy, not to kill outright, but to injure, to wear her opponent down. Dusty narrowed his eyes. He planted his front hoof in the dirt, lowered his head, nostrils flaring. Emily screamed, "He's going to be killed!" Roy raised the rifle again. Jack stopped him once more. "No, don't. He knows what he's doing." The eagle passed by like a black blade. One wing brushed Dusty's back. Another wound opened, blood spraying. But Dusty was ready. He spun with a speed no one expected from a bleeding animal. He lunged. Back legs lashed upward just as the eagle's talons swept near his throat. A solid hit. Contact. For the first time, the eagle lost control. Her balance tilted. She wobbled mid-air. Feathers tore loose, swirling like ash. The predator faltered. She climbed, circling but shakier now. Her power no longer felt infinite. The sky no longer hers alone. A final cry echoed, this time weaker, less certain. Then she turned and flew toward the mountains, slowly, silently, and she never came back. The field went still. Emily dropped to the ground, cradling Mason, crying into his hair. Sarah knelt beside her, whispering, thank you, over and over. Roy knelt, too, removing his hat with reverence, head bowed low. Dusty stood among them, not as the unwanted beast, not as the curse, but as the protector. He didn't tremble, didn't run. He simply stepped forward and gently touched Mason's hair with his nose, light as a butterfly landing. Blood still dripped from his wounds. But his eyes, they were no longer the eyes of a wild animal. They were the eyes of a soul, free, ancient, and chosen, a soul that had placed itself between life and death. For something it believed was sacred. Dusty stood there, amid the trampled grass and splatters of blood. The sun had slipped behind thick gray clouds, leaving only pale strands of light weaving through the trees, just enough to catch the slow drip of blood from his shoulder and neck. The wind swept down from the hills, curling around his legs like a silent witness, trying to carry away the marks of a battle no one had expected. But Dusty didn't fall. He remained standing, his shoulder sagging, one hoof slightly lifted as if reminding them all the wound was real, the pain undeniable. Emily slowly rose to her feet, Mason still cradled in her arms, her eyes fixed on the horse before her. Step by cautious step she walked forward, drawn not by curiosity but reverence, as if approaching something ancient, something holy. You did it for Mason, didn't you?" she whispered, not sure if she was asking Dusty or herself. The horse didn't answer. But when he turned to look at the child in her arms, his gaze had changed. It was no longer the vacant stare of a beast hardened by trauma. It was something more. Something people called awareness. A choice. Roy returned, having secured the rest of the horses. He approached carefully, holding the old first aid kit they always kept in the truck. He slowed when he saw Jack already at Dusty's side. The old rancher was removing his leather gloves, every motion deliberate, as if peeling back layers of something he no longer needed. "Let me see, old friend," Jack murmured, and no one could quite tell if he meant the horse or himself. His weathered hand pressed gently against the bloodied shoulder. Dusty didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't tense. Jack exhaled, long and slow. He pulled out a faded blue handkerchief and pressed it to the wound. Blood soaked it instantly. He turned to Roy. "Get the peroxide, gauze, now." Roy nodded and ran. Sarah sat under the mesquite tree, still holding Mason, her back against the rough trunk. She didn't speak, but her eyes never left Dusty. Mason reached a small hand toward the horse, giggling. "You want to touch him?" she whispered. "The one who saved your life." Dusty turned, slowly, cautiously, and stepped forward. Every hoofball was measured, not out of fear, but as if he understood the weight of what he was doing. Jack paused, allowing the horse to move. Emily stepped aside, clutching Mason's hand. Dusty lowered his head, and gently, so gently, he touched his nose to Mason's forehead. There was no sound, no motion. But for that breathless moment, the world stopped. Mason laughed, a clear, crystalline sound like morning dew breaking. And when he reached forward and touched Dusty's mane, the universe seemed to settle into place. Inside the barn, Roy cleaned and wrapped Dusty's wounds the best he could. He no longer called him the Black Devil. In fact, every time Dusty glanced his way, Roy gave a quiet nod, as if offering apology without needing words. Jack called the vet from Green River. The line crackled, and the vet said they couldn't make it until tomorrow afternoon. Jack sighed, setting down the phone. He turned to Sarah. "We'll have to care for him here. At least through the night. He saved your son, Sarah." She nodded, saying nothing, but her eyes were glassy. "We'll clear space by the east paddock. Shade, soft ground." Jack paused, then added for the first time, "He deserves that." Roy said quietly, "He won't want to be locked up. Don't build a gate." Jack nodded. "No gate, just shelter. He'll choose." That afternoon, they cleared out the old vegetable garden that had once belonged to Mrs. Whitlow. They built a quick shelter, open on all sides, clean, with fresh hay. No chains, no fence. The door left wide open, and Dusty didn't leave. He lay down beneath the shade of an old oak tree, eyes half closed, bleeding but silent, not asleep, not suffering, simply present. Jack stood watching him for a long time. Behind him, Sarah cradled Mason, while Emily held a bouquet of purple lupines she hadn't finished picking that morning. "We almost called someone to take him away," Sarah murmured. Jack nodded. "Yeah, good thing we didn't get the chance." Emily stared at Dusty, her voice soft as wind. "He stayed, Jack. Not for food, not for comfort. He stayed because, for a child," Jack finished the thought. Mason giggled. He waved a tiny hand toward the black horse resting beneath the tree. And from within the shadows, Dusty nodded. The next morning came earlier than usual, or at least that's how it felt to Jack. He woke before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The old wooden house still sat wrapped in a veil of thin mist, the air heavy with dew. Inside, only the soft footsteps of Sarah moving about the kitchen could be heard, along with a faint aroma of fresh coffee. Jack sat up slowly, bracing against the edge of the bed. His body didn't move like it used to, not like it had a decade ago. But something stirred him, something in the wind, in the scent of morning earth, in the distant whisper of pine and memory. He pulled on a wool sweater and stepped out onto the porch. The breeze carried the smells of dry grass and rusted fence wire. And there he saw Dusty. The Mustang stood motionless at the edge of the meadow, right where yesterday's battle had taken place. The sun had yet to rise fully, but its soft orange light had begun to slip through the clouds, casting a faint glow over his blood-matted coat. He looked like a statue, bronze and eternal, forgotten by time but unbroken. Jack placed a hand over his chest. What he felt went deeper than age. It was reverence. It was something he never thought he'd feel toward a creature once labeled untamable. Behind him, the door creaked open. Sarah stepped out holding a warm mug. She still wore her robe, her hair undone from the night. "You're always up early," she said softly. Jack didn't turn. No one sleeps well after a day like yesterday. She handed him the coffee. They stood side by side, gazing at the lone figure in the meadow. "Mason slept through the night," Sarah said. "I thought for sure he'd wake screaming. But no, he slept like nothing ever happened." Jack nodded slowly. "Maybe he knows someone was watching." Sarah smiled faintly. "I don't think Dusty's leaving." "No, he's not the kind to pick the easy road." Jack paused, then added, "He chose the one that hurts." Roy arrived mid-morning. He came on foot, no truck, no horse, just a man with a first aid box in one arm and a small bag of carrots in the other. "I brought a few things to check on him," he said to Sarah, "and maybe a peace offering." "He's at the east paddock," she told him. "Been standing there since before dawn." Roy walked slowly, his boots crunching through dew-wet grass. Dusty didn't turn. He knew who approached. He didn't move, just stared off toward the old fence line. Roy stopped about 5 feet away. He didn't push closer. Instead, he set a carrot on the ground between them. "I was wrong about you," Roy said quietly. "I was afraid of what I didn't understand, and I hated what scared me." Dusty turned his head, looked him straight in the eye. Roy swallowed. "Yesterday, you did something I couldn't. Even with a gun in my hand, I froze. You didn't. You saved that kid, and maybe you saved me too." The horse took a slow step forward. Roy stayed still. Dusty lowered his head and began to chew the carrot, then turned and walked back to the shade. Roy didn't follow. He wiped a hand across his eyes and managed a lopsided grin. "All right, old man, you earned the name. Dusty the Elder it is." That afternoon, Emily brought her students from the Rock Springs Elementary School, where she now worked part-time. A dozen kids buzzed around the ranch, peppering her with questions about the eagle, pointing at Dusty like he was a storybook hero. She led them toward the fence where Dusty was resting beneath the tree. He rose when he saw them. One little girl, Lily, whispered, "Miss Emily, does he know he's a hero?" Emily smiled. "I think he doesn't need anyone to tell him that. He chose to do what was right. That's enough." Dusty stepped closer. The kids leaned over the fence, reaching out tiny hands. He didn't flinch. He lowered his head, letting their fingers graze his forehead. "Thank you, Horsey," one boy whispered. As the sun began to set, the ranch was wrapped in a strange, soft stillness. No thunder, no eagle, just the wind and the sounds of home, creaking doors, rustling leaves, a distant owl. Jack sat alone on the porch, lighting a cigarette he hadn't touched in years. He looked out at the dark shape standing between twilight and shadow. Sarah came out with Mason in her arms. She walked him to the yard, letting the boy see his quiet guardian. Mason waved and shouted, one clear word, "Goo-goo." Dusty turned, nodded once, as if he'd been waiting for that. And Jack, for the first time in many years, felt peace. Not because the land was healed, not because the books balanced, but because something once forsaken had chosen to stay and become the soul that watched over what mattered most. On the high plains of Wyoming, just before dawn, the dew still clinging to the ghost-gray grass and the sunlight not yet bold enough to break through the haze, Jack Whitlow was already awake. He no longer rose out of old rancher habit. He rose because he knew someone was out there, waiting for him. Dusty, the black Mustang, was no longer locked in the isolated pen at the edge of the property. Jack had torn it down the day after the storm. No announcements, no explanation. He just walked out to the barn, took a hammer and saw, and began removing each wooden slat, as if dismantling the walls he'd kept inside himself for too many years. A new shelter was built, open, wide, and facing east toward the sunrise. Sarah's idea. She said Dusty deserved to be the first to see the morning light. Mason, now crawling faster than anyone could keep up with, often made his way to the southern fence, where Dusty usually stood like a silent sentry. Jack never let the boy get too close, but he no longer stopped him completely. Sometimes he even lifted Mason up to let his tiny hand brush through Dusty's mane, and each time the Mustang would lower his head gently, eyes soft, as if touching something holier than all his scars. Emily Raines, the nanny who'd witnessed it all, had left Red Butte Ranch by the end of that summer. She'd accepted a new job as an educational aide at the Rock Springs Elementary School. And during her first lesson, when the students were asked to present on a day they'd never forget, Emily stood in front of the class and said, "I once saw a wild horse charge a golden eagle to save a baby. No one else could have done it. And from that moment on, I believed, some souls aren't born to be ridden or tamed, they're born to protect what's pure." That story spread. At first, just among the school parents. Then the local paper picked it up. Soon, a group of media students from the University of Wyoming came to the ranch to shoot a short documentary. They called it The Guardian Stallion of Red Butte. Jack rolled his eyes at the name, but he didn't stop them. All he said was, "You kids can film what you want, just don't get in Dusty's way. He don't like noise." Roy, the man who once called Dusty the Black Devil, never left after that day. He asked Jack to keep him on, even refusing pay the first month. He mucked the new stall every morning, brought clean water, changed the hay, and once, when no one was looking, he stood before Dusty, cowboy hat clutched to his chest, and whispered an apology. Dusty didn't answer, but he stepped forward, pressed his nose against Roy's hand. Roy never drank again after that day. Sarah, every night, began writing in a leather-bound journal. She titled it, The Day the Sky Stood Still. She didn't write it to publish, not to post online. She wrote it so that Mason, when he grew up, would know that there are stories in this world that don't need to be believed, but must be remembered. One afternoon, while Jack was splitting logs out back, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the ranch. A man in a tailored suit stepped out with a young assistant. They introduced themselves as producers from a California wildlife documentary firm. The man handed Jack a printed check, $50,000, for exclusive rights to Dusty to feature him at a conservation ranch in Nevada. Jack looked at the check, then looked at the man, and shook his head. "That horse ain't for sale," he said quietly. "He ain't mine to sell." The man pressed. "Mr. Whitlow, you don't understand. We can give him everything. Publicity, comfort, sanctuary. Thousands of people could learn his story." Jack cut him off with a glance toward the east paddock, where Dusty stood in the twilight like a monument carved from dusk and defiance. "He's not a display piece," Jack said. "He didn't come here for fame. He came for something else. And when he's ready to leave, he will." The man said nothing more. That winter, Red Butte Ranch was invited to the state's annual spring fair for the first time. Sarah brought copies of her journal and a printed version of Dusty's story. Emily retold it on a small stage under a canvas tent. Elders wept. Children cheered. One little boy, always bullied at school, stood and said, "I want a Dusty of my own someday." Jack sat in the back, his cowboy hat low over his face. He didn't say a word, but he smiled. Sometimes late at night, Sarah would see her father outside, standing beside Dusty. Neither said anything. They just stood, two old warriors, side by side. Nothing more needed to be explained. Mason grew up brown-skinned from the sun, hair kissed gold, eyes as clear as the Wyoming morning. He had a habit no one could break. Every dawn he would toddle outside to sit beside Dusty for hours. No toys, no noise, just presence, as if he understood. This black horse was more than animal. He was a symbol of loyalty, of unconditional love, of that ancient, flickering instinct within us all, to protect what's sacred. Red Butte Ranch, once a forgotten dot on a dusty map, became a quiet place where travelers came not to see the horse, but to feel something, to remember that something true still existed. And when people asked Jack about Dusty, he would just shrug and say, "Not every horse is born to be ridden. Some are born to guard what matters." If you believe that some horses weren't born to be ridden, but to guard what's sacred, leave us a comment below. Just type 1, or drop a simple emoji to let us know you stayed with Dusty until the very end. And don't forget to subscribe to True Animal Stories, because the next story might just convince you that between humans and animals, there's a silent bond. One that can never be broken.